Story 1. Recent times have brought a considerable amount of disarray into my household. My significant other experienced a severe tumble during her equestrian lesson, resulting in a concussive injury. Consequently, during her period of recuperation, I have assumed the responsibilities of a dedicated, full-time caregiver for our canine companions. We are blessed with a trio of these creatures, and I can assure you, they are utterly charming. However, their disposition shifts dramatically into that of utter troublemakers if their daily promenade is neglected. One particular evening, approximately at 7:30, having just concluded the preparation of our meal, I became acutely aware of the intense gaze from the dogs, a silent ultimatum demanding a walk or threatening dire consequences. Ordinarily, my girlfriend and I would share the duty of walking them, but she was not feeling well enough to join me. So, I secured their leashes and resolved to undertake the task alone. Our residence is situated within a notably tranquil college community, adjacent to the university. Frankly, it possesses the kind of atmosphere where individuals frequently engage in solitary nocturnal jogs without a second thought. Our locale features an extensive expanse of verdant recreational areas and pathways. The residents here refer to it as the Verdant Trail. This is a continuous passage that bisects the northern sector of the city, adorned with foliage and seating arrangements, and it is perpetually bustling with runners, pedal cyclists, dog guardians, and elderly individuals performing peculiar martial arts routines. There is a specific recreational area directly behind our dwelling, which is our usual destination. We also tend to disregard certain regulations. Specifically, we unleash the dogs once we are sufficiently far into the park, as, to be frank, everyone else engages in the same practice. Thus, I found myself standing in the dim light, inexplicably listening to a certain melodious crooner, consuming a banana as if it were the zenith of my day, while the dogs frolicked, their small luminous collars glowing. After they had expended an adequate amount of energy, I releashed them and began our journey homeward. As I re-entered the paved section of the path, I observed a figure approaching me under one of the infrequent street lamps that illuminate the trail. The individual was of an imposing stature, exceptionally tall, possessing elongated limbs, and moved with a deliberate, unhurried gait that immediately instilled a peculiar sensation within me. This person brought to mind that unsettling extraterrestrial from the cinematic work, Signals. The manner of their locomotion was simply too slow and too fluid, akin to something one might encounter in a dream that swiftly transitions into a nightmare. What truly captured my attention, however, was how they were grasping an object. Initially, I could not quite discern its nature. Their arms were clasped in front of them, as if they were cradling an infant, yet the posture was remarkably rigid, suggesting a pretense rather than the actual holding of anything genuine. Moreover, their gaze was not directed downwards at the object. Instead, their eyes were fixed upon me, staring in a vacant, almost robotic fashion. It caused a profound unease to spread across my skin. I continued to advance, the dogs straining at the leash, who, upon reflection, were uncharacteristically silent and attentive. As the individual moved past me, I cast a glance downwards at what I had presumed was a baby, and an immediate churning sensation arose in my stomach. It exhibited no movement, not even the slightest twitch. It appeared to be made of synthetic material. I mean to say, it was either a manufactured plaything or I had just witnessed something utterly dreadful. In an attempt to alleviate the tension, I awkwardly uttered a soft "oh," endeavoring to be courteous or to defuse the unsettling atmosphere. Yet, this person did not react, continuing to stare directly through me, without blinking, acknowledging nothing save for keeping their eyes riveted upon my countenance. I proceeded past them, my heart racing, and tried to maintain a composed demeanor. But when I glanced back, and I solemnly affirm this to be true, they had come to a standstill beneath the street light and were deliberately rotating their head to continue staring at me. There was no movement from the rest of their physique. Just that unhurried, intentional head turn, reminiscent of a scene from a terrifying cinematic production. I swiftly increased my pace, checking over my shoulder again a few moments later. By this time, they had rotated their entire body to face me. Still standing there like an inanimate display figure, holding that imitation infant. That was the moment. I withdrew my mobile communication device and initiated a call to my girlfriend. I did not even attempt to explain the unfolding events. I simply instructed her to remain connected and to behave as though we were engaged in a typical conversation. She grasped the situation instantly and began conversing as if nothing was amiss. Meanwhile, I maintained a rapid walking speed, periodically glancing behind me every few seconds. The figure remained there for a while, merely standing and observing, without moving or uttering a sound. And then finally, after perhaps the sixth retrospective glance, they slowly rotated back around and resumed walking in the direction from which they had originally appeared. Never once did I observe them looking at the infant they were holding. Not a single time. I did ultimately contact the local constabulary merely to report the incident, just in case anyone else encountered them. The dispatch operator did not appear unduly concerned. They simply stated that they would dispatch someone to investigate. And yes, perhaps I am exhibiting excessive paranoia. The individual did not technically commit any overt act. But truly, that vacant stare, the simulated cradling, the slow, devoid of emotion movements, it was one of the most profoundly unsettling experiences I have ever had in person. Anyway, it is late now, and I intend to embrace one of the dogs and pretend I have not just played a starring role in the inaugural episode of some video-on-demand thriller. I always considered these narratives that people share to be somewhat chillingly entertaining, but now that I possess one of my own, I can confidently assert that real-life terrifying encounters are considerably more frightening when one is actively living through them. Story 2. This event transpired during my middle school years, likely around 7th or possibly 8th grade. Our educational institution had a rather pleasant custom where, on Fridays, with a signed permission slip from parents that morning, students were permitted to exit the school premises during the midday meal period. It felt like such a sophisticated and mature privilege at the time, to be able to wander through the neighborhood for an hour with one's companions. On that particular Friday, the meteorological conditions were quite agreeable. Cool, but not excessively cold. Perhaps even a slight drizzle, but nothing that compelled us to reconsider our intentions. So, my two closest friends and I resolved to stroll over to the nearby Oriental provision store to acquire some Eastern cuisine from their warmed food counter. Once we had obtained our styrofoam receptacles filled with oily noodles and pan-fried rice, we decided we would proceed to this park where we habitually spent our leisure time. It was situated approximately halfway between the academic institution and the mercantile establishment, and it featured one of those climbing frames constructed to resemble a colossal arboreal dwelling, complete with verdant synthetic leaves atop. We ascended and made ourselves comfortable within the play structure, sharing a large bottle of Golden Glow citrus drink for which we had all contributed funds, because, as you are aware, middle school monetary allowances do not precisely permit for individual beverages. This recreational area was, in fact, quite expansive. There was a swing set and a baseball diamond, several picnic tables distributed throughout, and an immense open expanse that sloped upwards towards a collection of residences with enclosed backyards. At the opposing extremity of the park was a slender waterway that delineated a walking path punctuated intermittently with benches and refuse receptacles. The waterway was shallow, barely a foot in depth in most sections, and across it lay an enormous enclosed parking area that led to this remarkably eerie, long-deserted hotel. It was a substantial edifice, perhaps 4 or 5 stories in height, all its fenestrations boarded up. Rumor held that the interior remained replete with antiquated furnishings and sleeping arrangements, as if it had been precipitously abandoned. People asserted that unhoused individuals would occasionally seek refuge there. And beneath the thoroughfare that bordered the waterway, there was this dimly lit passage that permitted the water to flow through. It was covered in various forms of spray paint. The kind of location that enticed one to explore it, but caused regret midway through. Anyway, we were simply relaxing, consuming our food, and laughing about trivial matters, when I observed someone emerging from the undergrowth alongside the waterway. It was an aged female, or at least that was the initial impression. She possessed one of those mobility aids equipped with rubber coverings on its legs, and her entire physique was bent over, as one would anticipate from a frail elderly lady. However, something about the manner in which she materialized from the vegetation already felt amiss. I mean, how does an individual with a mobility aid even descend into a waterway and then ascend back out again? She began to traverse the park, and instead of veering to walk along the designated path, as a typical person would, she advanced directly towards us. And I mean precisely. Slowly but surely, this individual was making her way through the verdant expanse and heading straight for our small treehouse platform. She was attired in an excessive number of garments for the prevailing weather, bundled up as though it were the depths of winter, and a covering was wrapped around most of her countenance. She wore enormous light-filtering eyewear that completely obscured her ocular organs. The entire presentation was oddly theatrical. She halted directly in front of the play structure, positioned at the base of the small ascent that led up to our sitting spot. And that is when matters truly began to feel incorrect. She was excessively close. We could not exchange whispers without her overhearing. I cast a glance downwards at her again, and something was inconsistent. The smile she offered us was not benevolent or grandmotherly. It was rigid and peculiar. And then I noticed something that sent shivers down my spine. Her dental structure. They were not teeth typical of an aged person. They were perfectly aligned, gleaming white, and far too impeccable for someone of her purported years. Definitely not artificial. And the scant portion of epidermal tissue I could perceive showed no signs of wrinkling whatsoever. That was the moment my cognitive faculties began to comprehend the situation. This individual was not a woman, and she was unequivocally not elderly. There was no one else in the vicinity, no parental figures, no other children, just us and this person. None of us possessed mobile telephones yet. It was that transitional period where one either owned a foldable phone or, like us, a handheld internet device. And thankfully, one of my friends had hers with her. She suddenly feigned receiving a communication and loudly declared, "Oh, my father is just around the corner. He is here to collect us." And then the most bizarre occurrence transpired. This so-called old lady straightened completely, as if all her prior hunched and struggling movements had been merely an act. Then she effortlessly picked up the mobility aid, tucking it under one arm as though it possessed no weight whatsoever, and then sprinted, engaged in a full-on sprint, out of the recreational area. We remained there, paralyzed, observing this supposedly fragile individual dash away like a trained athlete. And just like that, she disappeared. Once we had regained our composure, my friend confessed that she had fabricated the entire telephone call. Since one could not actually initiate calls on a handheld internet device without a wireless network connection, she had simply accessed the device's settings and adjusted the alert volume, which played her ringtone aloud. We had all genuinely believed her father had telephoned, and apparently so did the individual impersonating a grandmother. In retrospect, we are all convinced it was a male individual. The physical build, the vertical dimension, the manner in which they moved once the deception ceased, it all made perfect sense. They must have originated from that antiquated hotel situated across the waterway or even traversed that unsettling passage beneath the roadway. And honestly, I still experience chills contemplating what their ultimate intention had been had we not successfully deterred them. Story 3. This incident occurred just a few days ago, and frankly, I am still somewhat unsettled by it. So, my closest friend and I decided to arrange a meeting with some young men we had been communicating with. Nothing serious, merely an informal social gathering. We selected this immense recreational area situated near the outskirts of town. It boasts ample space and the privacy one might desire when discretion is preferred. However, it is also known for possessing a somewhat unsavory reputation. For instance, it is located in close proximity to a couple of residential transition facilities and a rehabilitation center. Thus, it is not uncommon to encounter individuals who are experiencing hardship lingering in the vicinity, especially those attempting to avoid difficulties or simply seeking a place to spend their day. The young men were proving to be exceptionally uninteresting, so we eventually found ourselves seated off to the side on the curb, conversing about various topics, when a young woman approached us. She appeared utterly disheveled, without footwear, devoid of a mobile device, with tears streaming down her cheeks, and visibly shaken. I do not typically lower my guard in this particular park, but something about her made it exceedingly difficult to refuse her plea. She inquired if she might utilize my mobile device to contact someone. And even though a part of me considered, okay, what if she absconds with it? I nonetheless extended it to her. She somewhat idly stood there holding it, then commenced weeping more profusely because she claimed she could not recall anyone's telephone number. She recounted having consumed alcoholic beverages with a male individual the preceding evening. Matters had deteriorated, and then she had experienced a blackout. The next thing she remembered was regaining consciousness, bruised and bleeding, in some parking area, subsequently being transported to a medical facility for a head trauma. She informed us that they had not even performed a forensic examination for assault and that she had simply been discharged at this park after stating she could not recall her residential address. She repeatedly apologized for disrupting our day. But at that juncture, our concern for the social engagement had dissipated. We simply desired to assist her. I volunteered to contact the emergency services, but she became exceptionally distressed and stated she did not place trust in the authorities. She asserted that no one listens to young women like her, especially women of color. And I comprehended her perspective. So instead, we pledged to transport her back to the medical facility ourselves, and to remain with her. However, when my friend departed to retrieve the automobile, the young woman turned to me and began to vocalize her intense fear that they would confine her to the psychiatric ward again, which caused me to hesitate. I was not privy to her complete narrative, but her conduct began to seem unusual. Then she started to insist that we take her to a certain convenience emporium several miles distant before proceeding anywhere else. I was not entirely comfortable with that proposition, but she was experiencing a state of panic, so we acquiesced. The journey there was quiet, save for her incessant rummaging within her bag. It was peculiar, as if her hand never left it, and I could sense her gaze fixed upon me as she murmured to herself. When we entered the parking area behind the establishment, she instructed us to drive to the rear, and there, 2 men were awaiting. As soon as we had parked, she leaped out of the vehicle and sprinted towards them, weeping once again. But one of the men did not even flinch. He merely stood there rigidly, seized her by the wrists, and exhibited no discernible concern whatsoever. That immediately triggered every warning mechanism in my mind. We attempted to elucidate the events that had transpired, thinking perhaps they were her family or something similar, but the man showed no interest. He gazed directly past us and then stated that we could accompany them if we genuinely desired to help. We expressed our intention to follow them in our own vehicle, but he insisted that we all compress ourselves into his compact sedan. Then the young woman began to backtrack, saying, "You promised you would stay with me." But now there was no more genuine weeping, only feigned sobbing and shouting. Suddenly, she seized my friend's arm and refused to release it, yelling into her face. I attempted to pull her off while this unfamiliar man began to accuse us of harming her and declared that we had to accompany them or face consequences. Then he grabbed my arm, attempting to guide me towards his automobile. I was terrified, but adrenaline surged, and I attempted to pull away. My friend, bless her, emitted such a loud shriek, like one of those terrifying movie screams that captures everyone's attention. It was effective. The man released me, shoved me backward, and dragged the young woman into the car before accelerating away as if nothing had occurred. We were in a state of shock, simply sitting there in the car, attempting to reconstruct the entire sequence of events. Initially, I was still concerned about her, pondering if she was being subjected to illicit trafficking or harm. We contacted the emergency services and recounted everything from the park to the store. A few days subsequently, the authorities followed up and informed us that the young woman had indeed been at the medical facility the preceding night, but not for an assault. She had been admitted due to substance-related issues and a psychological episode, something they indicated was a recurring pattern. As for the male individual, he was not related to her whatsoever. Not an acquaintance, not a romantic partner, nothing. However, He did possess a criminal record, and not an insignificant one either. He had been charged with multiple instances of aggravated abduction. Who knows what would have transpired had we entered that vehicle? Story 4. This incident took place during my final year of secondary education. I was a petite young woman, barely reaching 5 feet 3 inches in height and not even weighing 100 pounds. Typically, my romantic partner would transport me to school, but that particular morning he was occupied, which I later discovered meant he was engaging in surreptitious activities behind my back. Consequently, I was waiting alone at the recreational area near my residence where the educational institution's conveyance usually collected a few of us. That day, however, none of the other young women were present, just me, seated on a bench with a single earbud inserted, endeavoring to remain vigilant as I always did. I noticed a dark, cruiser, brand vehicle drawing near. And something about its presence immediately filled me with unease. It parked in close proximity, and I maintained surveillance on it without being overtly conspicuous, as I did not wish to appear overly suspicious, but my instincts were undeniably signaling danger. After a few minutes, 2 tall men emerged and began to walk towards me. The sensation in my stomach solidified. I swiftly dispatched a text message to my boyfriend and then replicated the message to my cousin, simply informing them of my location, the type of vehicle, and that something felt amiss. However, no one responded. As the men drew nearer, I rose and casually moved towards the edge of the pedestrian walkway near the thoroughfare, assuming the bus would arrive momentarily. One of them initiated conversation, posing strangely personal inquiries: my age, whether I had a romantic partner, if I resided nearby, and then, without warning, if I desired illicit substances, as they possessed some. The other man, who had remained silent throughout, suddenly interjected with something truly chilling. He inquired if I was familiar with the illegal trade network and informed me that they had just returned from a foreign country. The tone he employed was more menacing than cordial, and I was exerting every effort to maintain composure and refrain from reacting. They continued to advance incrementally towards me, and just as I felt as though they were about to make a move, the school bus finally rounded the corner. That bus was quite literally a lifesaver. As it approached, one of the men attempted to hand me this dubious-looking professional card, claiming he owned a motor vehicle service center and could provide me with a complimentary automobile. I was disinclined to accept it, but I also considered that possessing that card might prove beneficial if I needed to report them. So, I took it. The instant the bus pulled up, they swiftly retreated and walked away as if nothing had transpired. The moment I stepped onto the bus, I completely broke down. I was weeping so uncontrollably that the driver halted the vehicle to console me and inquired about what had occurred. When I recounted the events, she stated that she had observed the men near me, but assumed they were individuals I knew because of their close proximity. She reported it to dispatch, and upon our arrival at the school, she personally escorted me inside. The school took the matter seriously. Both security personnel and the principal sat down with me to obtain the full account. I presented the card, and the principal stated he would dial the number and feign being my father, simply to ascertain what the man would say. When he called, the man answered, and merely hearing his voice again caused my heart to race. The principal began inquiring about obtaining a vehicle, and the man feigned ignorance until the principal mentioned me. The second he uttered, My daughter provided me with your card." The man abruptly terminated the call. They attempted to redial, but the number had already been disconnected. Following that, the atmosphere in the room underwent a complete transformation. Both the principal and security appeared visibly shaken, and they immediately contacted the police. When the officers arrived, they requested that I recount everything in meticulous detail once more, right there in front of everyone. They stated that it sounded as though these men had been observing the recreational area, awaiting a day when a young woman was alone. The card, according to them, was merely a deceptive strategy. Bait to entice young women. That revelation made me feel profoundly ill, as if my lower limbs had ceased to function and my respiratory organs had forgotten how to draw breath. They attempted to contact my aunt, but she was not answering. So, they instead telephoned my boyfriend. Eventually, both he and my aunt appeared, and by the time I reached home, my entire familial unit was waiting outside. My grandmother, mother, aunt, uncle, and cousins. The men appeared enraged. The women were weeping, and I simply felt utterly drained. I could not cease contemplating how perilously close I had come to something dreadful. But here is the most astonishing aspect. Approximately 1 week later, the principal summoned me back to his office. He stated that 2 men in a dark, cruiser, brand vehicle had attempted to abduct a freshman girl from a different school not far from the park I had been at. Thankfully, other students were nearby and intervened to prevent it. The police presented a photographic lineup, and I immediately recognized both men. They were apprehended. It was indeed them. After that, my entire family united to ensure I never had to await a bus alone again. Even my now former romantic partner drove me to school on some days. I will forever be grateful that I emerged from that predicament safely, and even more thankful that the other young woman was rescued before the situation could escalate. Story 5. This incident transpired a couple of years ago during the autumnal season here in the United Kingdom. If you have experienced a UK autumn, you will be aware of how early darkness descends. Like full-fledged nighttime by 4 p.m. It was a school holiday break, so all the children were off, including my girlfriend's younger brother. At that time, I had been in a relationship with her for approximately 1 year, and her family regarded me favorably, so I volunteered to care for her little brother for the day. She had been feeling stressed, and I deduced she could benefit from some solitary time to decompress without any responsibilities. Her parents were traveling across the country that day and were more than pleased to allow me to assist. So, I arrived at their residence around 8 o'clock in the morning. They allowed me entry before their departure, and her brother emerged from bed about an hour later. My girlfriend arose not long after, and we all proceeded out for an informal breakfast. After we had eaten, I dropped her back home and took her brother to the neighborhood recreational area to expend some energy. By the time we arrived there, it was just past 2 p.m., and the location was teeming with families. Typical weekday amusement. But as I mentioned, autumn in the UK means darkness sets in very quickly. By 4 p.m. the park had completely emptied. I dispatched a quick text message to my girlfriend, informing her we would be heading back soon. Her brother and I had entirely lost track of time because we were simply jesting and enjoying ourselves, especially since we had the entire place to ourselves. We ascended this massive play structure equipped with a winding slide and were simply relaxing at the summit. It was essentially pitch black at that point, so I had my mobile device out, utilizing its illumination feature. Then I received a message from my girlfriend inquiring about our whereabouts, and I realized, yes, we should probably be returning. Her brother asked if he could go down the slide one more time before we departed, and I considered, why not? Now, before I descended, I had a precise mental image of the park's layout. There were benches, street lights positioned around the periphery, a few trees, all your standard park amenities. But when I emerged from the slide, something felt amiss. Standing directly under one of the street lights, there was this man, just present. He was attired in a lengthy trench coat and a knitted cap, and I swear he had not been there even a second earlier. Immediately, I pulled her brother behind me and held him close. I attempted to maintain composure and asked, "Hey, are you all right there?" simply to gauge the situation. He did not respond like a normal person. He began emitting these low, guttural moans. He was swaying slightly, somewhat rocking from side to side, and possessed this vacant expression on his face. His mouth was agape. He was drooling, and the entire ambience was wrong. I lifted her brother into my arms and began walking towards the path that led homeward. But I kept turning around to keep an eye on him. He never moved, just stood there under the light. Now, here is where matters became exceptionally strange. There is another path that connects to the one I was on, and they both ultimately converge onto the same main trail back to the neighborhood. I reasoned that if we simply kept moving, we would be fine. After a couple of minutes of walking, I finally relaxed a bit, thinking we had eluded him. But no, there he was again, just ahead of us this time, under another street light, manipulating something in his hands. I squinted and realized it was a bladed instrument. Not even subtle about it. I began walking more quickly, trying not to succumb to panic. The child had by then buried his face in my chest, clearly frightened. I continued to check behind me, and each time I looked back, that individual seemed closer. It was not as though he was walking, however. It was as if he would instantaneously transport to the next light. I counted the lights behind him, and sure enough, he was drawing nearer without emitting a sound. When we finally rounded the last corner towards the thoroughfare where my girlfriend resided, I heard it. This heavy thudding and louder, enraged groans. That was when it dawned on me. He was running. I took off at maximum velocity, not stopping until I reached the narrow passage beside her house. There is this substantial shrubbery by the gate in her rear garden, so I crouched behind it, clutching her brother tightly, and simply deluged her mobile device with calls, pleading with her to open the back gate. The moment she complied, I rushed us inside, slammed the gate, and secured it. After regaining my breath, I peered out the front window, and there he was, standing in the middle of the street where I had just been, still groaning, still clutching that bladed instrument. He commenced overturning refuse receptacles and pacing around like a deranged person. I immediately contacted the law enforcement authorities, but he had vanished by the time they arrived. Later on, I observed someone on a local community social forum discussing a similar individual being sighted not far from that park. Same type of conduct, but I do not believe anything ever resulted from that lead. Her family actually expressed their gratitude to me for ensuring her brother's safety. No one attributed blame to me for what transpired. Her brother appeared to recover the following day, but he still experienced nocturnal terrors from the ordeal. I am still permitted to supervise him occasionally, but we have not ventured anywhere near that recreational area since. Story 6. This occurred just last week, and I swear to you, it is unequivocally the most unsettling experience I have ever had. I am not typically one to be easily perturbed, but this truly shook me. I still experience chills merely contemplating it, and it is the kind of event I will likely remember for the remainder of my life. So, it was a weekday evening, and I decided to take my canine companion to our customary dog park. It is an enclosed area and generally quite vibrant around 5 or 6 p.m., as that is when most individuals are off work and bring their dogs to allow them to expend some energy. It had rained earlier in the day, but by the time I ventured out, it had cleared up. I presumed we would still encounter a respectable gathering, but surprisingly, only one other person and their dog were present. I recognized them. We have exchanged pleasantries before, so we engaged in light conversation while our dogs frolicked like lunatics. But something about the atmosphere that evening was simply peculiar. There was this dense mist hanging low over the park, imparting a damp and somewhat oppressive feeling to everything. The air was that unpleasant combination of humid and chilly, the kind that permeates one's attire and adheres to the skin. When the other individual and their dog eventually departed, I lingered to throw the sphere for a bit longer, thinking I could squeeze in a few more minutes before it became too dark. So, I am tossing the sphere, simply amusing myself with my young dog, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone. There is a man standing on the opposite side of the enclosure, clad entirely in black, with his hood pulled up, utterly motionless, simply standing there facing our direction. I could not discern his face, so I was not even certain if he was staring at me or not, but it instilled a profoundly unsettling sensation within me. Initially, I attempted to remain calm. I thought, okay, perhaps he is just observing my dog because he is a young animal, and people invariably do that. But each time I hurled the sphere in that general direction, attempting to casually ascertain if he moved or something, he remained still as a sculpture. At that juncture, I was becoming somewhat unnerved. The sun was nearly gone, and I began to realize how truly isolated I was. The canine exercise area possesses only one point of ingress and egress, and that individual was essentially positioned directly near the sole exit. I was disinclined to walk past him, but remaining stationary any longer felt worse. I gathered my belongings and slowly made my way towards the gate, endeavoring to act as though everything was normal. I glanced at him a few times. He was still standing there, but now he had rotated his body slightly more in my direction. So, I retrieved my mobile device and feigned being engaged in a phone conversation. I was speaking loudly, uttering phrases such as, "Oh, hey, I am on my way. You will be there in 15 minutes. Wow, okay, I will hasten." Just anything to convey the impression that someone was imminently expecting my arrival. The instant I exited the gate, he began to move. Not walking normally, however, but more like this peculiar, dragging gait. He would take a few steps, then halt, then he would rotate to look at me, then continue forward. This sequence repeated approximately 3 or 4 times, and then it escalated. His entire manner of movement shifted. He commenced lifting his legs in these enormous, exaggerated strides, resembling some kind of contorted ballet dancer tiptoeing through the parking area. And while he performed this, he consistently flung his head back to gaze at the sky in this rhythmic, unnatural fashion. It honestly brought to mind that unsettling narrative of the grinning gentleman. Exactly like that, except he was not moving rapidly. Just slow, deliberate, bizarre movements. Still pausing periodically to glance back at me. I had no recourse but to follow the identical pathway to reach my automobile, which entailed walking behind him. I maintained my distance, but I was entirely on edge. Every nerve in my body was acutely aware, as if my instincts were screaming that something dreadful was about to transpire. My hands were cold. My chest was constricted. I have never before experienced such profound fear. And then, all of a sudden, he turned sharply and vanished into the trees along the side of the path. For a moment, I thought perhaps that was the end of it. I accelerated my pace, hoping to pass the point where he had entered the wooded area before anything else occurred. Yes, that was the second poor judgment of the night. As soon as I passed that spot, I heard branches snapping. I turned and saw him charging out of the woods, this time rapidly. No more strange shuffling. He was power walking directly at me, his face still concealed by the hood, but his posture aggressive and rigid. That was all the confirmation I required. I seized my dog, who incidentally was completely oblivious and likely perceived this as some marvelous game, and sprinted the final 30 yards to my automobile. I somehow managed to hoist him up mid-run. He is not lightweight. And jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and ignited the engine with my hands trembling uncontrollably. As I was reversing out, the headlights briefly illuminated him. He was standing at the edge of the parking area, perfectly still again, simply observing me. I did not look back. I simply drove. And yes, I telephoned my mother and sobbed throughout the entire journey home. I did not feel secure for days subsequent to that. Even now, committing this to writing has caused me anxiety all over again. I informed a few other regulars at the park about what had transpired. And ever since then, I make absolutely certain that I am never the last person there again.